Okay, so I was talking to somebody yesterday about the role that the hip flexors play in kicking, specifically a side kick. 'Cause, Uh, this chap's student was having hip pain when he was throwing a side kick and pointing kind of to the outer edge of the hip and a little bit more, he said, internal. So I'm assuming it's this position here, which is a predominant hip flexor position if you have dysfunctional hips. And when you think about the hip flexor group, and I say group because it's a group of muscles that are responsible for flexing the hip, bending of the hip. We call that flexion of the hip or hip flexion. And it's a group of muscles that are involved in doing this, which we know from a stance, from a kickboxing, taekwondo, karate, anything, we have to chamber the leg to execute a kick, whatever kind of kick it is. If it's a snap kick or a push kick or a teep, if it's a side kick or a hook kick, it all comes from this high knee chamber position, which is a flexed hip. If these are dysfunctional or tight, you think that you're at a desk or you're driving a car or anything and you're sat in this position a lot, these things become short and tight. Subsequently, the opposing muscle, the glutes, become long and weak. And we need balance between those two muscle groups to be able to perform a kick correctly. And we'll talk about a side kick because that's the one that I was asked about. I gave him an answer and I felt compelled to do another video on it to elaborate and go on, because I can go on about this stuff. But we take a side kick. And classically, I'm going to come from a half guard sit here, from a half guard stance. I'm going to step in, I'm going to chamber, and I'm going to extend and strike. Okay, rechamber and place back down. Or you can come from a full guard point of view, which is a little bit more technical to achieve from the femur, from the hip. Recoil, place back down. And I was always taught to be able to throw any kick from arm's length. Boom, from side kick, boom, 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 round, hooks, anything. But you have to have a decent level of strength and mobility in the hips to allow that to happen. So when we're talking about poor mobility or dysfunctional hips, it's going to hinder us. So if we take this side kick, for instance, as I come from here, I've marked my distance and I step in or I step behind or whatever your execution method is. As I step in, first thing I do is chamber. And as I chamber, I flex my hip. My energy is still moving, if that's anterior to me, my energy is still moving towards my target anterior, which means it's going to pull my chamber across my body as well. So not only is my hip flexing, it's internally rotating at the femur. And a lot of people say turn the hip over, this is what they mean. Internally rotating the femur here means your hip flexor has to do 2 and probably 3 things in one go, whilst your energy is shifting towards your target. Then at the point of full chamber, you have to do the opposite motion, extend the leg, okay, and turn the hip back over in order to connect to your target. And the longer the lever goes, okay, as I straighten my leg, it gets heavy. It wants to drop to the floor. So I need my hips to remain strong to keep it pointing towards that target. Let's not even talk about the base leg today and what's going on here, but just the kicking leg. So from this full chamber here, my glutes are now kicking in to say, right, I need to pull the leg forwards. All right. My hip flexor group at the front here say, okay, glutes, I'm going to let you have that leg back and give you the motion that you're looking for to move towards your target. However, if my hip flexors are tight, because I do a lot of driving or I'm sat at a desk all day, fill in the blank, when I chamber this position and start to extend, it's going to fold me forwards at the hip. So I'm tilting forwards because these do not like to extend. They don't like to allow the bone to go straight beyond the pelvis. Hope that makes sense. So a couple of solutions to this is just to make sure, for one, that your hip flexors allow extension. Because the role of the hip flexor, for one, is to flex the hip, but it's also to allow extension of the hip. Back kick, side kick, even walking, your hips have to extend to allow you to locomote forwards. So we would look to dynamically do it before we kick. So we come into kind of an extended state and do some gentle rocks on the front knee to extend the hip behind. Now this will work better if that foot stays flat and you give a few rocks here. It's local hip flexor dynamic stretching. Dynamic stretching, not to be confused with ballistic. I'm not going to an end range and bouncing beyond. I'm coming from a shortened state to end range and back. end range and back. I'm not trying to push beyond that. I'm trying to stimulate the sensors of the start and the end of the hip flexor group, iliopsoas in this case, or major hip flexors, to allow me to have a deeper range of motion when I'm looking for this kick. And then there's a whole multitude of ways to stretch it post-kicking or in a stretching routine on its own. Okay, I'm going to go through one right now. If we drop down into an extended hip flexor stretch bit here, so I'm looking at my left hip, okay, I'm going to keep my back foot alive and my shoulders back with my hand on my leg in front. So I'm not hinging forwards here, I'm trying to push back, so my pelvis tilts backwards slightly and I get a stretch on the hip flexor. Now, from here, we're gonna manipulate the back foot and we're gonna manipulate the front foot to get the best stretch I can for my left hip flexor. And obviously you're gonna repeat this onto different sides. But if I just change my angle slightly and I come here, okay? If this is neutral for me, I'm gonna stay in this position for a good 30 seconds. 30 seconds I'm gonna say is a minimum for this. And then I'm going to creep my foot out to the side without changing the angle on my pelvis. So I'm not going to follow my knee. I'm just going to go from straight. I'm going to creep my foot out to the side and keep my torso exactly where it is. So I'm almost making an apex from my pelvis. I've taken my thigh bones and widened them slightly. Okay, so from this position then, 30 seconds hold. I appreciate that this is an express talk. Or not. I'm going to take my back heel, I'm going to start collapsing it in and twisting it out whilst trying to maintain this posture from my upper body. Because as I rotate my foot, it's going to start moving my femur internal and external. It's going to feel really weird on the hip, like you're wringing out a flannel or a towel, and that's what you should be looking for from the hip flexor to allow rotation when you're kicking. Okay? Nothing ever moves in one direction. We don't just flex the hip when we kick. It moves in, it moves out. As a base leg, it doesn't just stay still when I hinge up. As I go to kick this here, my base leg spins away. Whoop, spins away. So it rotates out at the hip. If you don't stretch this, the muscles of the hip flexor and more, but this case the hip flexor, if you don't allow the hips to rotate out and this one to rotate in, you're not going to get the execution you're looking for in any of the kicks that you're willing to throw. Be it round kick, roundhouse, axe kick, crescent kicks, they all require your hips, your hip flexors, to go through all 6 directions: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal and external rotation. But even if you just keep it linear, forwards and backwards, like a push kick or a teep, from my lead leg, boom, once I've extended this here, this hip is extending. And for demonstration purposes, it's flat, I get that. Okay, this hip is extended, this hip is flexed. So you need that synergy between right hip and left hip doing opposite things to enable you to kick accurately and correctly without pain and with a little bit of speed and power. Try the hip flexor stretch. It's a pretty good one, and there's so many more you can do in manipulating the limbs in a stretched state.